So just as a recap about the key information that you're going to need to know about this paper, the paper itself will be an hour and 45 minutes. It will contain two sections, a Shakespeare section and a novella section or a novel section. It is important that when you look through the paper that you leaf through or you turn through to the text that you have studied. So in section A, you're going to be looking for the question on Macbeth. And in section B, you're going to be looking for the question on A Christmas Carol. In total, you will need to complete 2 essay questions, one on Macbeth, one on A Christmas Carol. You should aim to spend around 50 minutes on each question, and for each question you will be provided an extract. As well as responding to the extract, you also need to make reference to other relevant parts of the text. Section A of the paper will be the Macbeth section. You could be asked to comment on either a theme or a character or kind of a combination of both. Main characters that you could be asked to write about would be perhaps Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, and past questions have seen themes such as guilt, violence, the supernatural, power, gender and ambition. So when you look at your question, I think it's really important as a first step to identify what you think the focus of the question is. So for example, if you look at the top of this extract, it will tell you whereabouts in the paper, whereabouts in the text the extract is from. And then you will be given your extract, and then at the bottom you have your question. So I want you to just read this really carefully and have a think about what exactly is it that you're being asked to do. So what you should have identified is that this extract is from Act 2, Scene 2 of Macbeth. And as you can see from the little description underneath, it says Macbeth has just murdered Duncan and has returned with the daggers to his wife, Lady Macbeth. So this is an extract that happens immediately after the regicide. The question says starting with this conversation. I want you to ignore that because actually you don't have to start with the extract. In fact, the way that we've taught you in lesson is that we want to organise ideas chronologically. So if, for example, your extract is from Act 5, you might write about that last. What you do need to identify though is what exactly the question is asking you to do. So in this one it says explore how Shakespeare, write about how Shakespeare explores guilt in Macbeth. So it's a theme focused question on the theme of guilt. So we might be tempted to go straight away to looking at the extract and highlighting kind of key ideas, key quotations in the extract. However, once you've established what the focus of your question is, I would suggest that actually you start by kind of noting down some key ideas that you might want to explore as part of your personal response. So for example, in this case, what key ideas, maybe 3 to 4, do I want to explore about the theme of guilt? So for example, some ideas that you could perhaps explore about guilt. So we would want to mention the fact that guilt is a punishment from God for committing regicide and disrupting the natural order. We would also want to mention that guilt is inescapable because at the beginning or after the regicide, Lady Macbeth appears to be guilt-free, but actually that's not something she can escape in the long term. And we can also then talk about like the wider intent, so that Macbeth's guilt acts as a warning to the audience against disrupting the natural order. And I just want to take this opportunity to remind you of this diagram that you should be really familiar with from your lessons. So essentially the 3 key ideas that we've just talked about are examples of what might go into your thesis statement. And your thesis statement is like your introduction that gives the overall argument that you're going to make. But as you can see from this diagram, the thesis then needs to be referred back to in sections 1, 2, 3 of your writing. And we need to make sure that when we're doing sections 1, 2, 3 that we organise the ideas into chronological order, but constantly making those links back to the thesis so that there's a clear structure and order to our writing. So now that we have the key ideas that we think we might want to explore for the theme of guilt, for example, we might then want to look at the extract. So by thinking about the key ideas first, it means that when we're looking through the extract, we're far more focused on searching for something. So in this case, if we think about our key ideas, we want to think about what exactly is being shown about guilt in this extract. So I just want you to spend a little bit of time going through the extract, so press pause now, and thinking about, if we were going to write about this extract for guilt, what quotations might we explore? So For example, some quotations that you could pick out on the theme of guilt from this extract is in the first section where Macbeth says, "Will all great Neptune's oceans wash this blood clean from my hand? No." In this quotation, he is suggesting that had he got all of the water in the ocean, he wouldn't be able to wash away the blood from his hands. And then we know that in the play, blood is symbolic of guilt, which implies to us that Macbeth is suggesting that he will never be free from the guilt that he feels after committing regicide. The fact that he uses this exaggeration, this hyperbolic language, implies the extent of his guilt. Juxtaposing that, you have Lady Macbeth who says, "My hands are of your colour, but I shame to wear a heart so white, and a little water clears us of this deed." So this particular sentence seems to be in complete contrast to Macbeth, in that she feels that they can wash their hands of the blood and then what they've done can be forgotten about. Alternatively, we could view the word deed as a euphemism, that perhaps she's unable to name the deed because deep down she feels guilty and therefore can't kind of admit what they did out loud. And I just want to take this opportunity to remind you of this diagram that you should be really familiar with from your lessons. So essentially the three key ideas that we've just talked about are examples of what might go into your thesis statement. And your thesis statement is like your introduction that gives the overall argument that you're going to make. But as you can see from this diagram, the thesis then needs to be referred back to in sections 1, 2, 3 of your writing. And we need to make sure that when we're doing sections 1, 2, 3 that we organise the ideas into chronological order, but constantly making those links back to the thesis so that there's a clear structure and order to our writing. Now, you want to then think about where your extract will appear in your essay. So as this is the first point at which the Macbeths begin to feel guilty after the regicide, it would make sense, because this is from the beginning of the play, that this would be the section 1 of your essay. And then you would think about two other parts of the play or the text that you might link that this event to. So for example, in section 2, you might want to talk about like the development of Macbeth's guilt, how his guilt continues. You could talk about examples of him seeing Banquo's ghost. You could talk about how he talks about "full of scorpions is my mind's dear wife." And then you might want to go on to, in section 3, talking about the development of Lady Macbeth's guilt. So initially in section 1, we talked about, on the surface, her appearing as if she was guilt-free. And then we could perhaps juxtapose this with Act 5, Scene 1, where she's shown to be sleepwalking, imagining like this blood on her hands, and she talks about all of the perfumes of Arabia will not sweeten this little hand. Once you've thought about other moments in the play that you could write about, then you'll think about how you're going to structure and organise your essay. So as kind of stated earlier, we'll start with a clear thesis that outlines your key ideas about the theme or character in the question. Then you're going to think about 3 key moments in the play that help to support your thesis ideas. One of these moments should be the extract. As you've been taught in the lesson, make sure that when you're writing about these 3 key moments, you organise and write about these moments in chronological order, because that's far more likely to lead to a really clear essay. Section B of the paper will be focused on A Christmas Carol. Similarly to the Macbeth section, you will be asked to comment on a theme or a character. Chances are the characters that you could be asked about would be Scrooge, perhaps the spirits. Previous themes that have come up are things such as redemption, the supernatural, greed, family, attitudes to Christmas, poverty and charity. So to look at a example question for A Christmas Carol, it will look quite different to Macbeth because obviously it is a novella rather than a play. So you will get a short extract. Again, at the top it will tell you what part of the novella that it's from, and then at the end it will give you a specific focus. I just want you to pause and have a think about what exactly this question is asking us to focus on. So what you should have identified if you look at the top is this is something that the Ghost of Christmas Present took Scrooge to see. Therefore, this is from Stave 3 of A Christmas Carol, so it is very much the middle of the text, and the focus of the question is the theme of poverty. So So now that we know the focus of the question, a bit like we just did with Macbeth, you should start by thinking about some key ideas that you might want to explore about poverty. So pause the clip and just write down a couple of ideas that you might want to explore about poverty. So just to remind you of the diagram, this is the way that you're going to structure your essay. So the points that we just talked about could form our thesis. Our thesis then needs to be referred back to and proven throughout the body of the essay. Section 1, 2 and 3 in chronological order, including the extract. Okay, so it's now time now that we've got some key ideas that we might want to write about, that we start thinking about any pieces of evidence that we might want to use from the extract to support the points that we're making. So I suggest you press pause and have a quick look and highlight or write down some ideas of quotations we might use. So some examples of the quotations that we might have picked out. This is of course a section where Scrooge is introduced to ignorance and want. And this shows the effects of poverty. So we could pick out the descriptions of ignorance and want as a boy and a girl, yellow, meagre, ragged, scowling, wolfish. And we could talk about that list of adjectives and how it emphasises the effects that poverty has. Perhaps the purposeful use of children to represent ignorance and want might also be important, because it's quite an emotive image for the reader, because obviously children are sort of associated with being innocent. In addition to that, you could also talk about where angels might have sat enthroned devils alert to show the effects that the poverty has had on these children. The children, of course, are symbolic of society's problems. You could talk about the spirit's response, that they are man's, so mankind created this problem, therefore suggesting that mankind should be the people to solve it. You could also potentially talk about how Scrooge kind of shows some concern and says, have they no refuge or resource? And the spirit's response, with his own words back at him, are there no prisons, are there no workhouses? And I just want to take this opportunity to remind you of this diagram that you should be really familiar with from your lessons. So essentially the three key ideas that we've just talked about are examples of what might go into your thesis statement. And your thesis statement is like your introduction that gives the overall argument that you're going to make. But as you can see from this diagram, the thesis then needs to be referred back to in sections 1, 2, 3 of your writing. And we need to make sure that when we're doing sections 1, 2, 3 that we organise the ideas into chronological order, but constantly making those links back to the thesis so that there's a clear structure and order to our writing. Once you've considered what you might say about the extract, which would probably form your section 2 because it is the middle of the text, you then want to think about some other key moments that you might use to write about for section 1 and 3. So again, I want you to just pause and have a think about what other moments in the novella you might use to write about. And I just want to take this opportunity to remind you of this diagram that you should be really familiar with from your lessons. So essentially the three key ideas that we've just talked about are examples of what might go into your thesis statement. And your thesis statement is like your introduction that gives the overall argument that you're going to make. But as you can see from this diagram, the thesis then needs to be referred back to in sections 1, 2, 3 of your writing. And we need to make sure that when we're doing sections 1, 2, 3 that we organise the ideas into chronological order, but constantly making those links back to the thesis so that there's a clear structure and order to our writing. So for examples, some ideas for you. Section 1, you could talk about stave 1 and the way in which Scrooge's attitudes to poverty and charity are explored. For example, you could talk about the way in which he treats the charity collectors and the things that he says, like his opinions of the poor and how they're idle and in their situation because they deserve it and because they don't work hard. As I said, you'd then go on to section 2 and talk about the extract and show the effects of poverty, which Scrooge is very much faced with by the ghost of Christmas present. And then for section 3, you might go on to talk about stave 5, where Scrooge realises the real reality behind poverty and becomes a more charitable person, because Scrooge is very much a role model to the audience for the change that Dickens wanted to see in society. So to summarise then, your essay structure, you will start with a clear thesis that outlines your key ideas about the theme or a character. You will think about 3 moments in the text that help to support your thesis ideas. One of these moments, of course, should be the extract. You need to then organise and write about these moments in chronological order. All that's left to say is massive good luck, Year 11. You worked really hard. You can do this. Just make sure that you read the question really well. Make sure you read the extract really carefully, and make sure that everything that you say is really closely focused on answering the question.